Well, shalom, everyone. Dr. Dinah here, and welcome to our Hanukkah presentation. And in this series, I'm going to be presenting from two different angles. The first session is going to deal with the historical perspective, and the second session is going to deal with the biblical perspective. And we're going to cover a lot of ground, a kind of a brief history overview from the time of the Babylonian exile leading up to the time of the birth of Yeshua. Now, clearly, this is a lot of history, over 500 years worth, so I can't go into detail, but I'm going to try to give you the high points to understand, because I don't think we really understand the significance historically of Yeshua's birth, and then obviously what he's accomplished as he comes forth as the newborn king. So hopefully as we go through this, you'll see the contrast then between Yeshua's birth and the time of this Messiah king who has come to restore Israel and the backdrop of world empire. And we'll talk about that in more detail. So one of the questions you might have is, how do you actually spell Hanukkah? Because I know you've seen it spelled in multiple ways, and it might be a little confusing. Sometimes we see it spelled with a CH, one N, two N's, one K, two Ks, sometimes with an H starting, and then one N, two N's, two Ks, either or. There's multiple ways to spell it. And just know that it's what we call a transliteration, which means that's how we pronounce. We've determined how to pronounce the Hebrew letters is all. It's not a translation, but rather a transliteration. The other thing about Hanukkah for us, I've been celebrating it since I was a little girl, long time now. There's a number of traditions that go with Hanukkah. One of our favorites is the foods, potato pancakes in particular. We call them latkes, and this comes from Eastern Europe. And so basically you shred potatoes, you add a little cream or milk, an egg, salt and pepper, a little flour, and here in New Mexico, we like to add green chili. And then you put oil in a pan and you fry that baby up so that it is crispy. And then when you eat it, you got to eat it hot, and you got to eat it when it comes out of the pan. Otherwise, it doesn't taste good. The longer you leave it, it tastes really soggy. So then you would add sour cream and applesauce, and it is delicious, and we love it. And of course, the oil is said to represent the oil that they found in the temple when it was only supposed to last 8 days, 1 day, and it ended up lasting 8 days. So the frying of the potato pancake in the oil is significant in that way. We also light what we call the Hanukkah, which is it's a menorah, but it's got 2 extra branches than the menorah. So you might know the menorah in the holy place in the temple is a 7-branched lampstand. But in this case, it's 9 branches. So we have each branch represented by the 8 days of Hanukkah, and then we have a 9th, which we call the servant candle. In Hebrew, it's called the shamash. And we take the servant candle, and each day we light the candle according to the days. So on the first day, we light 1 candle, on the second day, 2, on the third day, 3, and then on up to the 8th day. So that gives us 9 candelabras, if you will, on the Hanukkah. So the Hanukkah is specifically a term used for Hanukkah, but it is based off of the 7-branch menorah in the holy place. Another tradition that we have is the giving of Hanukkah Geld. Geld means money in German. So when I was a kid, we had chocolate-covered coins that we gave out each day of Hanukkah, that kids still do that today. So that was also a fun part of it. Often presents are given. So there's a lot of tradition today that goes on with Hanukkah. But we're going to try to delve into the history of Hanukkah, and what does the Bible have to say about Hanukkah, if anything? So in that, we are looking at the historical and the cultural background, especially through the period we call the intertestamental period. And that's going to lead us on up to the birth of Yeshua, beginning in Matthew chapter 1. Obviously, we have it in Luke as well. So Hanukkah is essentially being told through what we call the apocryphal books of the Maccabees. Now, there are 4 books, but the first Maccabees takes us from about 175 BCE, which is the time that the Seleucid kingdom is going to rise up, to 134 BC, approximately, to the death of someone we call Shimon or Simon the Maccabee. He's the part of the Hasmonean clan, family, dynasty. And so this book was originally written in Hebrew. We don't have copies of that anymore, written apparently by an anonymous Jew who authored it sometime in the 2nd century BCE. And it was translated into Greek, and that's the copy we have. The Greek text has survived. We also have 2nd Maccabees, which gives us a period of about 176 to 161. So it doesn't cover a particularly long period of time, but the focus is on the Hasmonean dynasty, which we'll get into more in this session. And it was originally written in Greek, so we do have that. And the whole culmination of the story of the Maccabees, the end of the book leads up to the importance of celebrating the Feast of Dedication, or the Festival of Lights, or what we call Hanukkah. Hanukkah comes from the root chanach, which means to dedicate. So the idea is that the temple had been desecrated by Antiochus Epiphanes, and so the altar was going to be cleansed, and the temple itself and the holy place. And so this idea of rededicating the temple back to God, because as you understand, the temple is ground zero for the life of the Jewish people. And essentially, it's true in the ancient Near East world. Their temples were the center of everything. And again, we'll talk about that in more detail. So we're going to go through a history of the period from basically the Persian kings on up to Yeshua's birth. And I would just say a very brief history, because this is a long, complex history. You would do yourself a favor to read more about the history of that period, because it makes what happens, Yeshua's coming on the scene with his birth, even more dramatic and more significant and important for the Jewish people, considering the 500 years of all of the oppression that they have been under from these various empires. And we'll talk about that as well. Again, it's a very complex, detailed period of history, and it's not something too many people spend time evaluating, but it's absolutely critical to see the picture. And what must the people have thought when Yeshua was born, the newborn king, the Messiah, after they've gone through multiple messiahs or kings. So Messiah in Hebrew is basically Mashiach, just means anointed one, and in this case, anointed for kingship. So I would submit through this teaching that one of the most important aspects of Hanukkah is going to point us to the restoration of the legitimate king, in this case, Yeshua the Messiah, and that we have had multiple illegitimate kings leading up to the time of his birth. So think about the contrast of that with the Hasmoneans and the Herodian dynasty. These guys were illegitimate kings, but they had declared themselves kings nonetheless. And of course, Rome had installed Herod himself as king. And in the mix of all of this, the true legitimate son of David, the legitimate heir to the throne, Yeshua, is born. So I want to plant that seed, because we're really going to be talking about that as we go through this. So that Israel, under all of these various empires, has faced the reality of 500 years plus of assimilation into these cultures and into the gods of these cultures, and to the difficulty of maintaining their separation and worshiping God and those things that would draw them near to God was a challenge through all those years. And I would just submit it's the same challenge we're facing today as we watch the culture become more depraved and sink more into this level of depravity, that the forces of culture that come to bear on Israel, as they are upon the people of God today, it's very intense. It's intense to try to push back against that. And so Yeshua, when he's born, is showing them the way of how they can separate themselves from the culture and to be able to worship him. So all these forces come to bear. So through that 500 years, Israel is facing the reality of extinction, that she has lost her identity as she's continually absorbed into these empires. These major empires, of course, they dominate the world at that time. But you can see there's sort of a precedent here to show us that there's nothing new under the sun, that this battle between world empire and Yahweh, God's people, and his economy, his kingdom of God. It's like the kingdoms of this world and the kingdom of our Lord and of our Messiah, who shall reign forever and ever. There's just this clash that's gone on really since the dawn of time. And we're seeing the exact same thing play out today. I do want to, I'll keep drawing your attention to that, because many applications can be made. And in a sense, Israel isn't going through anything that we aren't, in essence, going to experience today. And so hopefully their story will help us in our story today. And how do we deal with world empire? How do we deal with the culture of world empire that would come to bear on us and make life very difficult, to say the least? Now, if we go back to the Babylonian exile for a moment, I don't want to talk about that too much, but you'll remember that Israel was sent into exile. The Babylonians came in under Nebuchadnezzar, hauled the best and the brightest off to Babylon, and destroyed the temple and carried off all of the vessels, etc., and left the temple destroyed. So when that happened, this is probably one of the most important things in all of the Tanakh, which we call the Old Testament. And it doesn't really get enough, we don't focus enough on it, how big that loss was. It was probably for Israel the most traumatic event in all of their history, looking at the Tanakh, or the Old Testament. So the key thing is that their monarchy has been upended. So the last of the monarchy, it started with King David, and went on to someone named Zedekiah. And at that point, that was the end of what appeared to be the Davidic dynasty. And so the monarchy, or the true dynasty of David, had been upended. And along with that, they lost their temple, of course, which is ground zero for all of institutional life for Israel. So that means the temple is the center, the commercial center, the judicial center, the religious center, the agricultural center. All these things had been thrown into chaos as they had been exiled. And so they lost their monarchy, they lost the land, they lost their identity, all of these things. So try to imagine, after those numbers of years of the Davidic dynasty, to suddenly have everything uprooted and lost. Now, left behind were some people, but they were the ones they were not the influential people. They were not the elites of Israel's society going back. So the nation just kind of descended at that point. And so this put them in a status of shame, because they lost this is an ancient culture in which we emphasize guilt and innocence, but in their culture, they emphasize honor and shame. So to be removed from your land, to lose your identity, and to lose your king, put Israel in a place of shame in terms of all the other nations. And so this status of living outside the land put them also in an unclean state. Now, not unclean, we know that their sin has led to this situation, but to be unclean doesn't mean to necessarily be in a state of sin, but it is a state in which you can be resolved in that state. The state meant that you couldn't enter into the temple if you were unclean. So you went through a process. There was a mikveh, which is an immersion bath, we call a baptismal, if you will. And they would go through a process so that their status was restored. It's not about how clean you are on the outside or inside per se, but your status, to elevate your status so you could enter back into that sacred space. And so they lost that status. They were unclean because they were living outside the land, and they were exposed to things like, confronting corpses, for example. So if you had come in contact with a corpse, you were considered to be in an unclean state. Well, it didn't mean you necessarily had sinned. It just meant that your status, you were not allowed to enter into the temple and perform ceremonies if you were a priest, for example. So you have to be careful about that. But you got to figure the people are asking themselves in exile, had their God forsaken them? Where is he? Had he abandoned them? Would he bring them back from exile? Would he restore their temple? Would he restore the kingship and their identity? These are all the questions that they're going to have to ask themselves. So as I mentioned, world empires controlling Israel for hundreds and hundreds of years. And the battle for control over Israel, because they're in a very strategic location between the Egyptian or the land of Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia, between Egypt and the Fertile Crescent. And it's on the main travel routes and the trade routes between those two. And so Israel kind of found herself going, she would be under, for example, around the time of the Hasmoneans, actually before that, but she would be under the rule of the Seleucids, and then they'd fight, and then she'd go under the rule of the Ptolemies, which was Egypt. So just back and forth, she never had her independence or her freedom. She was enslaved to these tyrannical world empires. So try to keep that in your mind. And so as we come through, the Hasmoneans are the first actually to give Israel back their independence. But these guys were not what you call the best either. They enslaved the people and oppressed them as well. And then from there, we went into the Herodian dynasty. So all of this goes before Yeshua's birth. And so when Yeshua is born, he will, in fact, end their exile, but not in the way that they expected, and not necessarily the exile out of the land, as the protection from the Roman rule, because they're still in the land, but Yeshua is going to give them a type of exile, which we'll talk about. It speaks of that Yeshua would raise up the fallen sukkah of David. Again, it all goes back to the dynasty of David, that he, in fact, would restore the Davidic dynasty as the newborn king. And he would bring shalom and rest to them and take his rightful seat on the throne. Again, not in the way that the people had expected. And so we would see through all of this that Yeshua, ultimately, when a king came to the throne, he would defeat his enemies. And that's how he took the throne. And so Yeshua is going to do the same thing. He is going to deliver Israel from her enemies. He is going to restore order and justice and righteousness and provide wisdom. And we're going to see that all through his ministry in the Gospels. Now, again, the book of the Maccabees is really focused on the military campaign. The story in there does not tell us the story of the oil and the lighting of the Hanukkah. And we're going to talk more about that in the second session. But the line of the Hasmoneans is going to become important because they are going to declare themselves to be the rightful king and high priest, what they were not. And so we're going to look into the character of the Hasmoneans in this session a little bit later. So the key figure with the Hasmoneans is someone named Judah the Hammer, Yehuda HaMaccabee, and he's from the family of the Maccabees, essentially. His father, Mattityahu, and he has 5 sons. And this is going to take place under the Seleucid dynasty, which we'll talk about as well. But the key here is, how did this ragtag bunch of Yehuda HaMaccabee and brothers defeat this tyrannical rule of Antiochus Epiphanes, the most powerful empire at the time? Antiochus Epiphanes was a cruel, oppressive dictator who enslaved the Jews. And so the victory over this Syrian empire and the recapturing of the Temple Mount and the restoring of the temple and rededicating the temple and the altar is the key to the story of the Maccabees. So when we go back again, they were exiled from Babylon, but we're going to focus in on the Persian period, which under the rule of Cyrus the Great, he is the founder of that particular period called the Achaemenid Empire. It's the first Persian empire per se, and it's going to last about 200 years, from approximately 550 BCE to 350 BCE. And again, he is the founder of that empire, and he's actually called the king of the 4 corners of the world. And this is a period of imperial peace, kind of like the Pax Romana we have when the Roman rule under Augustus comes. It's a period of very stable rule, 200 years of it. He built up the capital, Cyrus did. And of course, the most significant thing he did in terms of Israel was he allowed the exiled Jews to return back to the land and even provided the funds necessary for them to rebuild the temple. This is key. So you can read about Cyrus in Isaiah 45, for example. He's called the Anointed One. He is referred to as a shepherd, and that'll become important in our second session because shepherds in the ancient world were rulers or kings, not necessarily out there with the sheep, although yes, shepherds were, but in the case of these rulers of ancient Mesopotamia, they were all called shepherds, who were, their sheep were the subjects, and their responsibility was to take care of the sheep and protect them from interlopers or wild animals, if you will, that would come and attack and destroy them. And so he was given this this title of honor. And he would ultimately be responsible for them to build back up the city and set the exiles free. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but after him comes somebody called Darius the First, and he rules from around 522 to 486. And I'm giving you all these numbers. Hopefully, again, you guys will go back and read the stories and read about the history here, but just to kind of give you a framework of time. Now, Darius I was said to have been an organizational genius, and he's the one who consolidates the Persian Empire and divides it up into what we call satrapies, which are like provinces or states, somewhere around 20 satrapies. And so each satrapy was governed by a local official or a governor. And the idea was that each of these governors would be responsible for collecting taxes from the satrapy, from the people, and sending it back to the capital for Darius I. His rule was marked by vast military expansion and expeditions. He had to fight back the Egyptians, and he took control over them. There's a lot that went on in his period. Again, we don't have time to go into it, but you can read about Darius the First in the book of Ezra, chapter 6 in particular. I'd suggest you go and read that. He's also called Darius the Great, and he is the one to oversee the completion of the temple. And it appears the temple was refinished, rebuilt, completed around 515 BCE, and that's going to become important. So just if you could file that date in there. And the reason it's significant is as we go on from Darius to Xerxes the First, he is, of course, Esther's Xerxes. And so all of that is going on. The temple is standing in Jerusalem. And that's something to consider when we're reading the story about those who are in exile, who have not returned back to the land, even though the temple has been erected and is standing. And we know that in Darius overseeing the temple, that there was a lot of pushback against that. The enemies of Israel did everything they could to disrupt the construction of it. We had people writing letters, the Trans-Euphrates governor writing letters to the Darius to stop him from allowing the children of Israel to rebuild the temple. So it was quite a period. You can read a lot of that in the book of Ezra. Again, I mentioned he reconquered Egypt. He incorporated Egypt into his empire, and he also took India at that time. One of the things he did as well was to quash a revolt from Greece. And it was the case that later he even his troops did to Athens to punish them for backing any kind of rebel action. Ultimately, he was going to be defeated and his empire weakened, and he forced the people under heavy taxation, and that only served to provoke more unrest. Again, these things are typical of what happens to empires, and over and over again through the course of human history. Now, his son was Xerxes the First, Xerxes, as I mentioned earlier. And Xerxes is going to rule from approximately 486 to 465, so approximately 20 years in there. And so his rule is kind of an interesting. He had to go back and take the land of Egypt after there were skirmishes between the two, and he also had to deal with the Greeks. This was a kind of common thread for the Persians. He increased taxes severely, and that ended up producing riots in Babylon. And so he came in and sacked Babylon and destroyed their temple. And he did something very interesting. He melted down this gold statue of the god Marduk. Now, Marduk is the head god, the chief of the pantheon of gods in Babylon. And at some point, a gold statue, 3 times the size of a man, had been erected of Marduk. So the question is this the same gold statue that's being talked about in Daniel chapter 3? So that's kind of interesting. And it said that he used the gold to rebuild up his forces in order to crush the Greeks. And this ultimately down the road, this is going to manifest itself in 480 BCE at the Battle of Thermopylae. And you might recognize that battle because there was a movie that came out called 300, in which Xerxes and the Persians, of which there might have been upwards of 100,000 troops, were fighting against this alliance between Sparta and a number of other 8 groups of people at the time from Athens. Of course, in the movie Spartan, there was 300 of the Spartans who go against this in army of numbers beyond anything what anyone had seen. And so, of course, the Spartans lost, and Xerxes won the day at the Battle of Thermopylae. So it's kind of an important battle, and you could go back and watch the movie if you want. There was an earlier version of that. I think Kirk Douglas was in it. So eventually, after the 200 years, the empire it was weakening, and it was entering into a state of decadence and depravity, and most of all had become very corrupt. And this is typical of what would happen with these empires. Is the bigger they got, the sort of heavier they got, they had to create giant bureaucracies. And these bureaucracies did not function well. They don't function well. And so it just the weight of all this, the entirety of the empire began to disintegrate. There was battling severe inflation, which is kind of interesting. And so they kept increasing the taxes on the folks. Ultimately, the army sort of became this ragtag of troops, and no longer powerful, no longer the most powerful entity in that region. And so it's within this time, this vacuum, if you will, that a new power is going to rise up, and that is going to be Alexander the Great. So eventually, the Persian army is finished under a King Darius III at the Battle of Gaugamela, and they say this is kind of a turning point in history. Now, even though Darius at the beginning kind of was well prepared, it said he had an army of up to 100,000. He had more cavalry than did Alexander. But Alexander was a very strategic and brilliant tactician, if you will. Alexander is the son of Philip III of Macedon, is Alexander III of Macedonia. And he spent all of his training under his father, to learning how to be a military strategist. He was able to spread out the empire through Western Asia and into Egypt. And the Persians pretty well underestimated Alexander, kind of looked at him as sort of some upstart. Then he was one who is able to capture Tyre off the coast of Israel there. And he was actually welcomed into Jerusalem. And ultimately in Egypt, he had put the plans together for Alexandria, the city of Alexandria, which is going to become a very important city with the library. The Lighthouse of Alexandria was considered to be one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. So in this battle with Darius III, and this is kind of the end of the Persian Empire, Alexander used his good resources and his wisdom and his strategery to, he captured the scouting party of Darius. He had gained excellent intelligence from that capture, and he went to town. He set up his typical strategies to take them, and then used that extra information. And ultimately, Darius suffered a major defeat at the hands of Alexander the Great. And he saw that the battle was hopeless. He fled, and with him, his Persian troops. And so the great power that enters in at this time is going to be Alexander the Great. Now, the key about Alexander is his dream of what we'd call a universal empire. So all these guys are kind of into what we'd call today globalism. They wanted more and more territory. They wanted more people under their rule. They kept expanding territory. So the Babylonian Empire compared to the Roman Empire, Babylon is quite small. So with each successive empire, they are stretching it farther and farther and farther. And so he had this dream of a universal rule that would be held together against a central government, that the government of the entire empire would be under one language, the same customs, the same culture, the same civilization, a highly centralized empire, if you will. And so it's within Alexander, as he's spreading this across the empire, is the birth of what we call Hellenism. And Hellenism functions, is supreme really between the time of Alexander, and of course his death, and then the emergence of Rome in the 1st century. And it's basically this devotion to ancient Greek thought, culture, customs, styles, everything you can think of. And it had a tremendous and profound influence on Greek civilization. And that in turn influenced Rome civilization, areas like Rome and Carthage in India and other regions at the time. So Hellenism eventually is going to encroach upon the Jewish people, and is going to force them under this cultural milieu into which they can't function in daily life without the basic requirements of knowing the language and following the customs. So there's a real battle for the Jewish people in preserving their lifestyle, their God, their ceremonies, how they operated, their language, preserving their observance of the Sabbath and all of the commandments that God has given to them. They're trying to keep that all intact, their families and their communities, etc. And this force of the Greek language and Hellenism is coming to bear on them. Now, they're not a large number of people within the empire of Alexander the Great. They're pretty small. And so you could see how easy it would be just to kind of take them out. So in order for them to conduct commercial trade and enterprise, they were going to be required to function under this Hellenistic environment, and the emphasis was for them to become steeped in their manners and customs and culture. So that's going to put a tremendous strain on the children of Israel, and really an irreconcilable differences between Judaism and Hellenism. So that's one of the battles that has to be fought for centuries. And so Hellenism was kind of the system of thought, again, and language and spirituality. And it's centered around the worship of the Hellenic deities of the time, Zeus being the chief deity who would transform the world. And so Antiochus Epiphanes embraced this. He embraced Zeus as his god. And so, again, the influence of this continued well into the 1st century, even after Rome took control. And eventually, many Jews succumbed to it, unfortunately. And they kind of had to choose between the Seleucids and their own culture. The Greek culture had placed a lot of influence on the Sadducees, for example. So it had an effect on things. So after Alexander the Great died, which was around 330 BCE, he didn't actually live all that long. He was 32 years old when he died. Somehow he fell ill and mysteriously 12 days later was dead. They still don't really know what happened to him. And his empire was divided now. So he had a fairly large empire. Now it's chopped up into 4 generals, Lysimachus, Cassander, Ptolemy, and Seleucus. Now they go through battle and we end up with just the 2. And the 2 that we want to focus on and remember is the Seleucid kingdom and the Ptolemaic kingdom. Now the Seleucid empire covered Syria and into what we call not Palestine, Syria, Babylon, and Persia, and even into India. On the other hand, the Ptolemies, that was going to cover Egypt and into what we call Palestine, anciently was called that. So there's this 125-year running battle between these 2, the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. And it was said between 319 BCE and 302, approximately 20 years, Jerusalem changed hands 7 times. 7 times in 20 years. Try to imagine that in our own nation today, that we would, just for argument's sake, in 7 times between the Russians and the Chinese, for example. Not saying that's happening, but that's the kind of thing, imagine. And so all the culture and the language and stuff can change. But again, Hellenism and the Greek language is the predominant force, even under the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. So there were political factions that formed in Israel, power struggles, and often they had to choose sides. Are they pro-Seleucid or are they pro-Ptolemaic? And they were caught in the middle of all of this. And so the book of Daniel, chapter 11 in particular, outlines all of this. And so there's just this ongoing battle against the world empire connected to the ruling class, the political elites, and then there's the people. And so Hellenism continues to spread. Greek statues are erected everywhere. Architecture is Greek architecture. Inscriptions, literature. Again, I mentioned the library in Alexandria. Even we have later on what we call the Septuagint, which is going to be the translation of the Old Testament in Greek. And so, and that's going to take place at Alexandria, and is going to be very important for the future. And so the Seleucids ultimately took power from the Egyptians somewhere around 200 BCE. Antiochus III is defeated by the Egyptians, and is incorporated into Judea, the empire of Judea, if you will. The Jews, of course, are divided in their allegiances between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, as I mentioned before. And after Antiochus III dies, now we have Antiochus Epiphanes IV, and he is going to be the one who is ruling the Seleucid kingdom, that is the Syrian area and Babylon, etc., at the time of the Maccabees. So that's key. Now, Antiochus Epiphanes is a despot. He is eccentric. He's narcissistic, like all good tyrants. He is not dependable. He is extravagant, and he is a tyrant for sure. His name Epiphanes means divine king or God incarnate. And so the joke was they would call him Epimanes, which means the madman. And as I mentioned before, he converted to the worship of Zeus. In Daniel, he's called the prince who destroyed the sanctuary and erected a statue of Zeus. And so he erected a statue of Zeus in the holy place in the temple. He oppressed the people, massacred the Jews, and prohibited the practice of their faith. Any kind of, there was essentially capital crime to celebrate the Shabbat or to circumcise their children. And again, he desecrated the temple. And so Jewish worship and ceremonies were forbidden, and there was a profound contempt for Jewish culture and Jewish ceremonies and just the entire the life of Judaism. Mothers were literally forced to hang their babies around their neck, and this led to the strangulation of these babies, and they were not allowed to cut the children off. They let them just rot on their neck, and it resulted in many committing suicide. I mean, can you even imagine such a thing? He eliminated the high priesthood, and also ultimately rededicated the temple to the Greek god Zeus. This is very significant, outlawing the Torah ultimately, and one could be executed for circumcising their children. So this is a season of massive persecution on the Jews, and it's within this environment we have the rise of the Maccabees and their revolt against Syria. So somewhere along 170 BCE, this is when Antiochus marched against Jerusalem and plundered the temple and carried off the vessels. And so it would be in 168, a few years later, in Kislev, the month of Kislev, which is the 9th month on the Jewish calendar. We kind of associate with December, somewhere in there, that the Maccabees are going to capture the Temple Mount and the altar of burnt offering and replace it. I should say that in 168, this is when Antiochus Epiphanes had offered up a sow or a pig on the altar of burnt offering, and he actually replaced the altar of burnt offering with a pagan altar. So it'll be shortly after that, in which the Maccabees story comes to bear, in which they take control. So Hellenistic reforms caused a lot of conflict for the Jewish people. The upper middle class or upper classes welcomed it, actually. How typical. And the priests from the aristocracy would often send their children for Greek education in what we call the gymnasium. And so you can imagine that there's kind of a clash then between the upper classes and the folks. Again, this is just typical of what you have over and over again. The gymnasium was the center of Greek political, social, and cultural life. The Greek culture, their approach to life was what they would call being cosmopolitan, which simply meant to be a world citizen. Does that sound familiar? So the whole idea was to encourage this idea of global citizenry. And so no longer was a person's identity associated with their birth and nationality. So education was ranked supreme in Greek philosophy, adopting the Greek culture and customs. One would advance socially and become a citizen of the wider Greek world. So it was all about being a citizen of the world. So originally, the education system in the Hellenistic world provided sort of this infusion of this culture. And it became independent. It was no longer part of the community and the family like we had seen with the children of Israel, or like we would see later on, or even how we understand it today. It became a separate entity. And so in Hellenism, the professional was supreme. The sports people got paid the big bucks, entertainers, actors, musicians, athletes, as I mentioned, and politicians. And so the center of the city was where the Greeks' ideas were kept alive, and the gymnasium reflected a clash then between what we would call the cosmopolitan ideal and just how the regular people lived. So this clash continued on. Athletic training, I'm sure you recall that they would compete in the gymnasium unclothed. And so Greek men were uncircumcised, and in order to participate in the gymnastic life, one would have to be uncircumcised. So some Jewish men would reverse their surgery. So this is profoundly affecting the Jewish people in Judaism. One of the high priests, I think it was Jason, even located a gymnasium outside the temple. So that the idea of circumcision as a sign of a covenant relationship to God their obedience and commitment to God is upended by this, by what the gymnasium called for. So this massive assimilation into Greek culture, and basically meant to Israel of abandoning their covenant commitment to God. Now, earlier, there was a high priest. His name was Onias. He actually had fled to Egypt under the protection of the Ptolemies. And he was the last of the Zadokite high priesthood, the last of what we would consider to be the legitimate line of the priesthood. There was a battle then between who would take the high priesthood after him. And Antiochus Epiphanes appointed his son Jason to take over the high priesthood. And as I mentioned earlier, Jason was the one who converted Jerusalem into a Greek city with a gymnasium. And he established an arena for the public games close to the temple. So, in the course of all this, many Jews were in fact seduced by the virtues of Hellenism. And we could argue today as a similar, you can see the church being seduced by cultural elements of today and not stepping back and standing back, because it would cause them to lose their power and their influence, and people become very addicted to sort of the comfortableness of being well connected, etc. So they're in the midst of all that. There were Jews who fought against it. Now, the revolution began again with the Maccabees in a town called Modi'in, Mattatyahu, the father, and his sons. This began around 167 BCE, and they ultimately overturned the altars. They slayed any apostate Jews, and even went so far as to kill the king's commissioner. So you can imagine the retaliation there. The Syrian garrison, of course, would seek them out on Shabbat. And so they actually had a new interpretation was given of the Torah that made it permissible for them to fight defensively on the Shabbat, the Sabbath. And so they employed guerrilla warfare tactics. And the Jews were able, this group, to defeat this powerful Syrian army. It's interesting that Yehuda HaMaccabee was recognized as being the Lion of Judah in his time, the warrior king. And so we could contrast that, what we see in the book of Revelation, but Yeshua as being the true Lion of Judah and warrior king. He built up the regular Jewish army, and he started with prayer and fasting. And that was how they built their army to ultimately overthrow the Syrians. They gained control of the temple, and they discovered, as legend goes, and I'll talk about this more in the second session, we don't really know much about this other than from the Talmud, in that they found a vial of oil with the seal of the high priest Onias. That was the last of the Zadokite priests. And in 166 BCE, they were removing all of the contaminated vessels and the contaminated garments of the priests and the furniture, etc. And they uncovered this vial of oil. And they only had enough for one day, but apparently it continued to burn for 8 days. And I don't want to get too much into that now, because that's more in our next session. So Jerusalem was recaptured, the altar was rededicated, and the temple. And again, Judah was a brilliant guerrilla warfare strategist, and he made alliances with Sparta and with Rome in order to give protection for the Jewish people. So the Hasmonean, the family was the Maccabees, the Hasmoneans. The Maccabees are part of the Hasmonean. They're kind of the dynasty, if you will. And they continued on fighting the Seleucids, and they gained control over the region. And in fact, they're the first to establish independence for the Jewish kingdom. So imagine this is hundreds and hundreds of years, and the Jewish people in Judea don't have any kind of independence. And so the Maccabees, under the Hasmonean family, were able to establish that independence. And so this is very significant. So you can imagine that how they're worshiping the Hasmonean dynasty, and they're seeing the Hasmonean dynasty probably as being legitimate, because they've taken over, they've taken control of of Israel, and they've declared themselves to be king and high priest will follow. Talk about that in 1 second. So this establishment of the Jewish independence and kingdom, and that was going to be until the Romans conquer Israel. That will be under General Pompey in 63 BCE. So again, this is the first time in centuries in which they had control. And but world empire being what it was going to fight for that control. And so Onias, he had expected to return as high priest, but again, he wasn't. Jason was the one that was given that position. So I want to talk about Simon the Hasmonean. Now, he is the younger brother of the 5 of Yehuda, and he ultimately end up as the only surviving brother. And so he took over when Yehuda died, and he was kind of the right-hand man, and fought valiantly against the Syrians. He was a military governor for the entirety of the coastal area of Israel. He was, again, the surviving member of the Hasmonean dynasty. He began to fortify Jerusalem, and in 142 BCE, that's when the declaration of the Judean independence took place. He fought against the Tobiads, and he declared himself high priest and king, or Nasi, which means prince. So he is the first in centuries to take upon himself the role of high priest and king, this royal title. He even had coins minted for himself under permission of the Seleucid emperor. And so when we read about in Daniel 9, for example, 25, it speaks about the issuing of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the prince, therefore, comes along after 7 weeks and 62 weeks. So it may be that the prince here, the greater prince, of course, is going to be Yeshua, but in the historical story, that prince may well be Simon the Hasmonean. So Judah again became a sovereign state under Simon the Hasmonean, declaring himself high priest and king. But he was not the legitimate ruler to the throne. The legitimate ruler needed to come from the royal line of David, in the same way that high priest needed to come from the line of Aaron through the tribe of Levi. So we have internal divisions begin to erupt with the Hasmoneans. They were the imperial power, but things start to kind of come loose there. They end up ruling for about 103 years, which is pretty significant. And until somewhere around 40 BCE, the King Herod comes to the throne, the Herodian dynasty. So Israel at that point becomes a Roman client state, and that's kind of the end of the Hasmonean dynasty. And the successors to Simon, the Hasmonean, are going to be John Hyrcanus and Alexander Euné. They were not good guys. And the reign of Hyrcanus and Euné, they, of course, are pushing for military expansion and to expand the, quote, kingdom of Judah. The Seleucid rulers at the same time are losing their power grip. They're kind of going into a state of decay. So the Hasmoneans were able to conquer the Galilee and Idumea, which is out of which Herod comes. They forced the Gentiles to convert to Judaism. They began mass conquests past the Jordan, expanding their boundaries. And their military expansion did not benefit the Jewish people. They were absolutely ruthless and absolute monarchies. They were brutal in every way. They crucified their political foes. They turned kind of mercenary forces against the people of Jerusalem. Euné was responsible for crucifying thousands of Pharisees, and the Hasmoneans at this point had centralized their power through their rule through the office of high priest and king. Let's just say that the Jewish people did not love Hyrcanus. And so the Maccabees the dynasty begins to fall into disfavor, and it becomes defiled by an abuse of power, kind of typical. Now, the period of the Hasmonean dynasty was seen as the nucleus of the awaited Messianic kingdom. You can imagine that they would have viewed the Hasmonean rule as the Messianic kingdom being made manifest. So the Hasmoneans were seen as walking in the footsteps of David, although not the legitimate. And this period is a period in which they reestablished their theocracy and serve as the preparation for the Messianic kingdom. It was all bound up in the success of the Maccabees. So that's kind of key here in this. So the Hasmoneans ultimately become weak. They lose control, and disputes begin. Civil war starts up between Pompey and Julius Caesar. The Jews support Julius Caesar because he made Judaism legal. He allowed the Jews to be free essentially from empire worship, imperial worship, but they still were responsible to provide an additional sacrifice to their God and ultimately to the emperor. So there's a conflict there. And so we'll close up this with just now comes into power Herod the Great around 337 BCE to 4 the Common Era. He's installed as king by the Romans. He is appointed high priest, and everyone to worship him. He is considered himself to be of noble lineage. He is from the Idumeans. He begins massive building projects. For example, he expands the temple to its widest extent. The expansion of the temple is very key. His crowning achievement is going to be the port of Caesarea in honor of the Emperor Augustus. And so he built a magnificent, opulent city, Caesarea, and it was said to be a masterpiece of engineering. And his rule, we find excessive taxation, the use of mercenaries, and the use of secret police in order to take control. So the history is one of turmoil and intrigue and cruelty and oppression. And into that, the Jewish people are oppressed under the underworld empire. So it's a very challenging period in history. And so I would just encourage you to read what you can about it. And I will pick this up, and we will be talking about the perspective of the Bible in our next session. So I'll see you then.